Good evening, Mr. Anderson. Prime Minister Hariri has made a lot of concessions, but will they be sufficient to end the protest? Because as we speak, I can see some people in the background.
Good evening, Kathleen. As you mentioned, Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri did make some concessions earlier today, which were announced a few hours ago. He was announcing concessions such as a privatization of the telecoms companies, a popular move. Things like cutting the salaries of ministers and also MPs, a reduction by half in those salaries, and also a pledge to bring down the budget deficit. Now, will that be enough? I mean, protesters here have said many of the people in government have been in power for decades. They haven't come up with a solution so far. Why should we trust them to come up with a solution now? What they really want are resignations from the very highest levels of government. As you can see, protesters have not gone home. They're on the streets behind me in Riyadh Salah Square, and it doesn't look like the protests are going to quieten down anytime soon.
How did this happen, that the announcement of new taxes on, for instance, WhatsApp and Messenger provoked this kind of rage and anger?
Absolutely. Well, it's important to understand that this comes on the back of decades of economic mismanagement and corruption by the government. So this is not happening in a vacuum. The last major protests to happen in the country were in 2015 when the government failed to deliver a solution to a trash crisis which saw trash piled up in literally rivers of trash in the streets of Beirut. Then, more recently, last week, there were wildfires which devastated much of the country. What really angered people during those fires was the fact that there were 3 firefighting helicopters that were just left sat on the tarmac because the government had failed to find replacement parts. So they were unusable, and these fires were absolutely devastating, and they tore through large parts of the country. Then, as you mentioned, on Thursday, it was reported in local media that the government was planning a number of measures in the 2020 budget, including this tax on online phone applications like WhatsApp of just $6 a month, but on the back of an already incredibly expensive telecommunications costs in the country. This, many said, was the straw that broke the camel's back, and on Thursday afternoon you had protesters coming down to the streets in their hundreds and then thousands, and they haven't left since.
Who are these people on the streets? There are a lot of families participating also.
There certainly are now. I mean, it started perhaps on Thursday and Friday. There was a different feel. And while many different sections of Lebanese society have been represented from the outcome, perhaps there were more. There were a lot of young men, some of whom were perhaps unemployed and wanted to voice their frustration at the government. So on Thursday and Friday, there were some violent clashes with the government. Since then, over the weekend, thousands of Lebanese from all over the country, from all different social and religious backgrounds have been coming down, as you say, with their families, with their kids, older and younger people.
What do you expect for the coming days and weeks?
Well, that's a good question, Kathleen. So we know what the protesters want, and that is resignations from the top of the government. Now, is that going to happen? Many of those in government either have been in power for decades themselves, or are from very well-entrenched political families who have been in power for decades. They don't look like they're going to leave anytime soon. They don't look like they have any intention to give up power. If they were to give up power, what happens next? Is there really someone, or are there people waiting in the wings who can really provide an alternative to for a Lebanese future that the whole nation can get behind? We just don't know yet.
Okay, Finbar Anderson, thank you so much for joining us.